So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first session of the Festival of Trusteeship. Today, it's the last day of Trustees Week. It's the last day of the Festival of Trusteeship. Today, we're talking about how can trustees show leadership on equality, diversity and inclusion. We've had a lot of interest in this session, which is absolutely brilliant. And before I pass over to Puri Dillon, who's going to chair the session, a little bit of housekeeping. So as you've come in, you will have seen that the session is being recorded. If you've booked this event individually, you'll be sent the recording later today. If you're a weekly pass holder, you'll get all of the recordings from the week also later today. You've been muted automatically as you've joined the room. Please stay on mute unless Puri comes to you for a question, just to keep the sound nice and clear. We've enabled closed captions at our end, so if you want subtitles, you need to find the closed caption button on your device and select that. Please feel free to use the chat as much as you'd like, to share reflections, to give examples, to ask questions of the panel. Please keep your comments respectful. Please also feel free to completely ignore the chat. We're finding that people are very much in one camp or the other. Some people find the chat very distracting. And just to let you know that the chat is on the recording. So if it's something that you want to catch up with afterwards, you absolutely have the opportunity to do that. We don't have any more networking sessions this week. The last one was last night. Thank you to our media partner, Third Sector, who helped us really shout about the festival. And we've had hundreds and hundreds of people along with us this week. And then a giant thank you to Ecclesiastical. Ecclesiastical sponsorship of the festival means that the most anybody has paid to come to an event is £5. And we've had lots of free events, including our whole stand for aspiring trustees. So on that note, I'd just like to pass over to Faith from Ecclesiastical, who's going to say a few words.
Thanks ever so much, Penny, and good morning, everyone. We're really honoured to be sponsoring the Festival of Trusteeship again this year. As a specialist insurer and risk management partner for charities, we're very committed to the sector and have been for over 135 years now, supporting not only with our specialist expertise, but also our expert knowledge of the sector through our research. And some of that research on trustees that we've done recently has been shared throughout the festival this week. We've also just launched our charity risk barometer report. If you've not seen it, have a look at it on our website. We've interviewed over 250 charities about the current risks, and it was also published by Third Sector last Friday. You may also be aware that Ecclesiastical Insurance is part of the Benefact Group, and this is a group of financial specialists or services companies with a shared ambition to give all our available profits to good causes. So that means that we're the third largest corporate donor at the moment in the UK, with aspirations to reach number one. But we do, and this is where your ears might prick up, we do run a programme of giving each year open to all charities. And I know a number of you will be trustees or representing charities in some way today. These are the Movement for Good Awards. I know Penny or somebody will be popping the link in the chat for you as well. And you can nominate your charity or non-profit or KIC for a grant of £1,000 at any time during the year. And if you're a young person or children's charity, this is the last day today to nominate for a special £5,000 grant as well. And we also do a large grants programme. So if you haven't seen it before, have a look. But we very much hope you enjoy the festival and today's session. Thanks ever so much, Penny.
Thank you, Faith. And I'm going to pass straight over to Puri.
Thanks, Penny. Thanks, Faith. Good morning, everyone. It's really lovely to see so many names popping up that I recognise and we've worked with before. That's always exciting. Welcome to Getting on Board session on how can trustees lead on equity or equality, diversity and inclusion. I think for the sake of brevity, we might refer to it as EDI in our session today. My name is Puri Dillon. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the director of the Social Justice Collective. And as I just said, there's tons of our groups that we have worked with here today, which is exciting. I think we've probably worked with at least over 100 charity and social justice, social enterprise boards to answer today's question. So I'm thrilled that we had this time together today to unpack it a bit more. Today, I've got the pleasure of chairing the panel, this excellent panel of people with tons of experience to share with you. So I'm actually going to go straight into intros from each of them. I wonder, panelists, whether you could just say who you are, what boards you sit on, and a little bit about yourself in that way, and then we'll go into questions. I'll go alphabetically and start with Audrey. Test of my alphabet straight away, isn't it?
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. Thank you very much, Perry. So my name is Audrey Roy. I've had 33 years in the natural environment sector, which as a lived experience is quite interesting and far from diverse, definitely the first and only black face in many national park and outdoor area car parks. So my experience is quite broad, covering management of operational teams and including whole organizational and digital transformation. And I've had experience of two relatively small charities, one very rural creative arts focused, very localized, Herefordshire, and another with global reach, specializing in outreach and enabling for women in Africa. I'm really pleased to be on the panel today, and I'm also currently, as LinkedIn would say, looking for other trustee opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. And I'll go to Daniel next.
Thanks very much, Perry. So hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Chan. I am a director at PwC, and I lead our work with charities at PwC. I'm very proud to do that. But in addition to that, I also hold a trustee role at UK Youth, where I'm the honorary treasurer. And I also am a governor at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama as well.
Thank you, Daniel. And I'll come to you next, Adele.
Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be here this morning. Just briefly, Edel Harris. I have served on a number of charity boards throughout my career, but most recently, probably and relevant to today's session, I was the chair of the Life Changes Trust, which was concerned with young people who had been in the care system and people with dementia and their families. I've been a trustee on the Robertson Trust, which is a foundation, a grant-giving organisation, Aberdeen Football Club Community Trust, and the Fragile X Society, which is a very small charity. My son, Ross, has Fragile X syndrome. And most recently, career-wise, I was the CEO at the Royal Mencap Society, or Mencap as it's more formally known. And I've taken a brave, I think, but hopefully good decision to step down from that role at the end of August and to set up a little consultancy business advising charities. So lovely to be here, and I hope some of my experience is helpful.
Thank you, Adele. And last but not least, Sanjay.
Thanks, Perry. I'm Sanjay. I have been a trustee and a chair for over 20 years at various organisations, long stint at community foundations, including London Community Foundation. I have passed on that role now because my time ended. I'm currently trustee at Inclusive Multi-Academy Trust, primary schools in and around Watford, and the independent trustee of the Rugby Football Foundation, which is the RFU's charity organisation. For my day job, I run post-merger integration programs. I've actually just taken on two charity clients to run a merger for them. It's only been about 4 weeks, so I'm learning it from the other side as well.
Thank you so much. And I'm slightly overwhelmed by hearing those introductions. You are clearly very busy people, so thank you for being here with us today. I also forgot to mention that I'm also a trustee, so I am on the board of UK Black Pride, and also a local school governor. So think about this with those hats on as well. So I'm going to jump straight into questions. And the first one I wanted to ask was around the movement away from just the D in the ED&I. So up until 3 years ago, the Charity Governance Code had a diversity principle, and that largely focused at the time on who sat around that board table. Then obviously in 2020, 3 years exactly from November 2020, it expanded to becoming the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Principle. And that was really to recognise that it's not just about who is sat around that board table, but actually what does a board do and how does it do it? So I wanted to open with a question really for asking you, from your experience, if you could share some real or tangible examples of what boards that you have been a part of have done to deliver on E, D and I, so that equality or equity, diversity and inclusion throughout their organisations. And I'm going to go to Audrey first.
So I'll take both of my recent or past charity examples. The creative arts one, rural media, Herefordshire based, but focused also to an extent, a little arm's length around Gypsy and Travellers community, which is quite present in the Herefordshire area. And it was an interesting mix. On the one hand, trying to be a charity that had a rural and creative arts agenda. They had to deliver things, work with local communities, but at the same time, working with a community which was very much on the edge of society. And that created quite an almost, some might argue, incongruous dilemma in that how do you do the two, because you could consider them quite specialist. And the approach we took there was to use the creative and arts objectives within the charity and focus on how traveller and gypsy communities could be creative and artistic in their own right. And that was very much around celebrating their heritage and their history. So that's on the one hand how we used the work we did to become inclusive and to be diverse. And as an organisation, bringing me on board, and I'll be honest and say it was a little bit of a tap on the shoulder, because my work with Natural England had brought me into contact with them and over many years, and they kind of thought she'd be really good. And I'll be honest and say I, without answering any of the other questions, I did suffer all the usual things around imposter syndrome, but we'll talk about that later. And I focused very much on how I could help the organisation open up. So its work, to an extent, was inclusive with youth and young people. It expanded that by bringing an element that it had been tinkering with right in around the gypsy community in terms of its work and the body of its work. So its objectives, you could argue, were very fully addressed. And then in its structure, in terms of the people employed and worked with, we focus very much on outreach, looking more widely across the community. Herefordshire is not the most ethnically diverse, but diversity covers a whole range: neurodiversity, disabilities, a whole range of things, age, gender. So we were looking at it quite broadly. I'd say the challenge for me is stepping outside of my race and ethnicity box sometimes and remembering it's not all about being the only Black woman in the car park, and thinking quite broadly. And I was working a lot with DEFRA and the wider civil service on ethnicity and race projects, and sometimes I had to compartmentalize that so that I could focus more broadly. So I would argue, in summary, the E, the D and the I are all equally important. They reinforce each other. We start with equality. Everyone has a voice. You know, well, we another conversation to talk about white privilege and issues around that. I don't like to focus on that label, because my argument is we all have a different kind of privilege in our communities. The real issue, I think, is that everyone has a voice and everyone is equitable or treated equally to start with. Then you focus on the diversity, which is within that cohort. How can we make sure that those that perhaps have a smaller voice or have not had a voice historically or aren't able to influence can come into the fold? And that could cover things like progression within a charity or an organisation, promotional opportunities, and so on. And even just the ability to speak out in a meeting, depending on your gender or your neuro or other diversity. And then the inclusion is about focusing on allies and ambassadors, those around us who can help to reinforce the key messages, and where we can promote or reach out to others to bring them in. So that's how I would see the E, the D and the I being delivered going forward, but also my experience in how I've done it in one particular charity.
Thank you so much, Audrey. And just even as I was listening to you, I was thinking I want another whole conversation to talk about power and privilege and how that operates in organisations. But really powerful thoughts. Thank you. Adele, I'm going to come to you next.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll use, because I always think when you're at sessions like this, it is helpful to get some practical examples to take away and to think about. So I'll share my most recent experience working almost 4 years as CEO at MENCAP. So it's a learning disability charity. I'm sure many of you know that. And one of the first things that I was keen to do when I started at MENCAP, of course, acknowledging immediately that there's a we here, it's not an I. I didn't make any of these sort of decisions or progress any of this work on my own, but I had a very, very strong view about the strapline. So if you cast your mind back 4 years, those of you that know MENCAP will know that the strapline was the voice of learning disability. And I felt really strongly that we weren't the voice of learning disability, that people with a learning disability themselves had a voice. And so the strapline was dropped. I know it still pops up sometimes on old logos, so you don't need to email me afterwards and tell me you've seen it. But the point is not really the MenCap story, but the point here is about, in a very genuine way, boards and senior executives of charities giving the people that they are there to serve a genuine voice. And it's not always an easy thing to do. I think we would all, everyone on this call would, agree that it is it's something we should do as charities. And a lot of charities try it, and I'd say do it well. But it's not always easy to get it absolutely right. So if you're talking about people with a learning disability, who of course are all unique individuals, they bring diversity within their disability. But by the very nature of their disability, in order to be a trustee on a board, they're going to need an awful lot of support. So in MenCap's case, we recognised this and said, well, if we're going to have trustees with a learning disability, which we absolutely should do, then we have to think about the way we present the papers. Are they accessible? We employed someone full-time to support our trustees with a learning disability, both in the meetings and out with the meetings. We also had a Voices Council, which was made up of elected people, all of whom had a learning disability. And certainly before I left, we were moving towards the CEO reporting or being held accountable by both the chair of the board, who doesn't have a learning disability, and the chair of the Voices Council. I'm not sure if that's continued since I've left. So there's a lot more I could probably say about that, but the point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that if we really want to include people, we have to think about making reasonable adjustments, supporting them as an individual, because they'll have particular needs because of their disability, but they may have other support needs. And I would urge organisations not to have the one person with the disability, or the one black person, or the one gay person, but actually think much broader than that, as Audrey's already said, around what equity, diversity and inclusion is. Final point, because I want to obviously give others a chance to speak, is that in my experience, when you start to look at boards and think about EDI, it must be in the context of a much wider organisational strategy that's aligned to your values. And my pet hate, it's a personal thing, this now, I'm not speaking for MenCap, I no longer work there, but my pet hate is when it's seen as an HR initiative that's sort of tagged on to everything else that you're trying to do. And I'm seeing lots of nodding heads, so fortunately I'm saying something others agree with there. So yeah, anything that you do as a board around inclusion must be part of a much wider organisational strategy. I'll leave it there for now.
Della had a physical reaction as you said that. I was like, oh yes, I so strongly agree with that. I often think about really when organisations do this work of EDI very, very well, it's when they've got very clear on their organisational purpose and why EDI is central to that. And so the answer of what do we do around EDI will be different depending on what your organisational purpose is. And within that, how do we create justice? How do we see power and privilege showing up in ways that are not helpful? So a disability charity will, of course, be different to a community hall or a human rights campaigning group. And it's when we get to that level of nuance that I think where we begin to crack it. You also made a really powerful point there around being the one person on a board, and I'd love to explore that a little bit more. I want to acknowledge that our panel today is made up of trustees with lived experience of marginalisation. We've had a couple of you talk about it already, as well as people with EDI expertise, and I think those two things are different. So that lived experience plus that expertise around EDI. From my experience, it's often the case that just one trustee with a marginalised identity or specific identity gets given the responsibility for EDI and the board, just as you've said, Adele. I want to ask what your thoughts are on this and on who should be leading this work at board level. I'm going to start by coming to Sanjay on this one.
Sorry. Let me follow on from what Adele said. This has to be a whole organisation thing. It can't be led by one person, the individual who has a marginalised characteristic. We've probably all been in that position, to have been the one person of different colour, different disability, difference of whatever kind, to be asked to do that role. It takes quite a lot of strength to say no, and then go back to say, actually, what should the right thing be for this organisation? I've been fortunate enough to have lots of kind of EDI guides in my world that have been able to support me. So yeah, it needs to be led by the organisation from the highest point, whether that's the chair, vice chair, ideally someone that comes from a non-marginalised background, because ultimately, it has to be for everyone. And then that needs to be cascaded across different layers, because leadership from the top is all well and good. It then needs to be implemented, reinforced, enhanced, changed, whatever the appropriate manner is for the organisation at different layers. Because the challenges that exist not just at board level, but in senior management teams and in staff teams. We do need to be conscious that we need to reflect on the community we work in. One of my other panelists mentioned Herefordshire. Achieving diversity in Herefordshire is very different to some of the charities I've worked in across London. The characteristic of our communities and population is very different. Wanted to talk about kind of the approach we took. Probably the best example of mine that's worked through a bit was through the work I did at London Community Foundation, where we recognised that for this to work for the organisation, we had to start at board level. The board had approximately 15% of members on it with an EDI characteristic. We said, actually, that's not good enough and not reflective. And that was a broad, we looked at what does EDI mean for us? And we came down to, obviously, we were quite good at gender, but we concluded for us it meant race, socioeconomic status, and most importantly, age. And age was a really interesting one for us, because we were all 40, 45 plus, and a lot of the communities we served were 20s, teens. And how do we get those people on board? And one of the biggest learnings were, not only do we have to have mechanisms to get change at board level and through the organisation, but we as individuals had to change, because either their level of support, their level of experience coming in was different. And we were, ultimately, trustees are responsible for governance, so there needs to be some kind of, there are certain things we have to follow. So making the changes within ourselves was actually the hardest piece of that journey. Sorry, I've drifted a bit, but yeah, the leadership, we were fortunate that once it was offered to me, but we pushed back to say, actually, no, this needs to be chair driven. The chair was not from a marginalised group, and he accepted those arguments, and it worked much more effectively, and we all played a part. So I'll pause there to give others a chance.
Thank you, Sanjay. And again, really struck by your comments around positions in the board as well. So from our experience, sometimes it is the case that there is a trustee or a couple of trustees who get given EDI responsibility. But hearing you talk about the chair, the vice chair, the treasurer having responsibilities around EDI feels like a really important thing. And I can see that being echoed in the chat as well. Audrey, I'm going to come to you next.
Well, and I think Daniel just put his hand up as well. I was just going to briefly come in anyway, and say, within organisations, I think the golden rule in the invisible EDI handbook for trustees, if there is one, is there has to be senior leadership support. I would argue sometimes you have to start somewhere by bringing in, I know it might sound tokenism, the EDI hire. And where I am in Scotland, and it's very difficult to resist that, because I've said no to an organisation because I didn't feel there was that chair and that leadership support. But on the other hand, I've also come in where I felt there was that chair and leadership support, and they needed someone to help be that kind of like the blue touch paper, the catalyst. So in a way, it's a kind of game of two halves, as they would say in football, or indeed any other sport. So I would argue that there's a bit of give and take. If you know that in that golden rule there is senior leadership support, but they just don't look right, they don't have the diversity and they need to get it in to start from the inside, then go for it, because you know that you're on a journey and you know you're working with an open door, more or less. Yes, you do have work to do, but you know that anything you say will be taken, will be acted on, because you've got that senior leadership support. But yes, quite right, with others, it's a no if you know that you're going to be the token and you're going to be doing all the work. And that's not how you root and embed what is meant to be long-term, systemic and inherent EDI within an organization from the inside out. And that's about culture change. So who's ever tried to make significant cultural and transformational changes anywhere, in a small group, in an organization, in a network, in your Scouts or Brownies group, without it coming from the top? Very, very difficult.
Thank you,
Daniel
Audrey.
wanted to add something if we have time.
Daniel,
yeah, only a very short one, which is my view on the kind of the trustee responsible for EDI or a particular aspect of EDI. It's not so much they're responsible for it, but I view it as they're responsible for empowering others or the board. So in my view, the trustee responsible for a particular EDI characteristic or EDI overall doesn't necessarily need to belong or have lived experience of that particular characteristic per se, but they do have a responsibility as an ally. I think you made the point earlier, Perry, to have that allyship for that particular kind of group, the EDI characteristic, EDI overall. And it's that responsibility for empowerment. So often we say it's responsibility for that characteristic, whereas my view is it's responsibility for empowering others and to kind of include others and to shine a light on it, rather than take overall responsibility for everything just to do with that thing, because it's about the championship. It's about sharing with others, I think, rather than owning it, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Daniel. And again, it's making me think of the idea that EDI is just good governance. If we're doing it the way that we should be doing, it's good governance. We wouldn't say, here's the person responsible for legal matters on the board. None of us are now responsible for it. It doesn't work that way. But how do we empower one another to take that collective responsibility? That's fabulous. Thank you. So I've seen a few questions that have popped up around good practice, and I wanted to explore this a little bit more with you all. So from your experience of having led this work at board level, are there things that you would say, well, this is really good practice that others could do? And I understand that actually in every context, it will be slightly different, but are there some common things that we can suggest a good practice? But equally, are there some things that we can share with our participants that they really, really should not do? So those sort of clangers or those mistakes where perhaps we tokenize people or other things like that they really shouldn't do. And I'm going to start on this one with Daniel. So I'll come back to you, Daniel.
Yes, no, absolutely. So I guess there's a couple of examples that I would probably point to. I think first of all, it's around within the trustee board. How do we get that atmosphere and environment of making sure we are taking this seriously? And there's a number of ways of doing this. The culture clearly forms part of it, but something that I've experimented with and I've sort of liked is almost at the start of meetings, and this can be at the board meetings or management meetings, is to kind of powerfully share examples of where inclusion has taken place in practice in the organization in the recent past. And that just focuses the mind on everybody as we go through all the other potentially non-directly EDI related topics, actually to have that lens on EDI overall. So example of how particular groups or stakeholder groups might have been had inclusive practices involved, just SLT or the management team, or even individual trustees attending maybe some of the charity events, sharing that, or even in their wider experiences, that just helps to focus the mind. I think as a trustee, I also like to be involved in some of the discussions that SLT have with colleagues in the charity, and indeed with users, beneficiaries of the charity as well. And I've certainly found that to be useful. And I think those groups also see it being taken to a different level of priority when a trustee is actively engaged as well. And we all do trustee roles, not because we think it's a tick in a box, but because we care about the cause and the charity. And so for me, it's about going beyond the kind of minimum of just attending board meetings and actually going to see the work, going to have these discussions with the groups. So a good example is, I guess, in LGBT History Month, for example, I went along to speak to the LGBT kind of network within the charity. Network's probably $2,000 for a relatively small charity, but the kind of group that was kind of empowering and championing it within the charity, together with the CEO, together with the COO of the charity, and really for them to hear kind of our discussions at the board level that relate to them and what they find important, but also for us to hear from them around the initiatives, and for them to hear actually there is a trustee on the board holding management to account for the actions that they've committed to, I think is really powerful, because we do hold them to account, but none of that is often visible to those across the charity and indeed to some external stakeholders as well. So those are probably a couple of examples which I think are good practice, or that I've seen work for the context that I've been in.
Thank you, Daniel. And again, I'd love to unpack this accountability piece around EDI work, because I think there's a lot more that we could be saying around good governance. But I think you're right, that signalling of accountability to people who can sometimes feel disempowered within a staff team is such an important one. Thank you, Daniel. Adele, I'm going to come to you next.
Yeah, this is a huge question, isn't it? It feels like a thesis question, really. But listening to Daniel there, I just wanted to pull out a few key points from my perspective. In giving this answer, which is maybe a less than positive one, I'm not talking about MenCap, just to be clear. It's a general, from the different boards and different charities I've been involved with, so it's general. But maybe it's not so bad now as it used to be many years ago. But there was, if there's ever such a thing as a typical trustee, there was often boards were made up with very good people, obviously with very good intentions. Often the phrase used is, I want to give something back, and would maybe have, so I'm massively generalizing here, but would maybe have a very paternalistic kind of approach to whatever the charity they were involved in. And I've seen that as a bit of an obstacle, even though, as I say, life's moved on and boards have moved on, and I'm not saying that's how it is today, but there is a legacy of that. And so I think it's one of the obstacles when you're trying to really embed EDI in an organization, and you've got to have good behavior and good role modeling at the board level. And I think that old-fashioned kind of paternalistic way of thinking about charity beneficiaries, particularly on the inclusion piece, sometimes gets in the way. The other thing I've seen as a constant, and sadly a constant negative, is fear. There's a real fear of getting it wrong, whatever it might be. One of my trustees, I won't name the charity, said to me that they felt that they were walking through a field with landmines, and they were doing their real best. This was a white man, just so you can imagine the story, and he was doing his best. But he said he just feared that everywhere he walked, he was going to make a mistake and stand on a landmine, and therefore he was frozen. He didn't move. And I think that we should acknowledge that particularly for those who've maybe had more privileged upbringings, who don't have lived experience. For many people, this is sort of new and difficult territory, even though they've got very best intentions. And then the last thing I would say around this question is power and risk appetite. Because you're on a board, you do have, as well as a lot of responsibility, you have a lot of power, and sometimes there's a fear in giving away that power. Maybe that's ego driven, or maybe it's more about, but I'm the person who's responsible, so I need to hold on to that power. And the other one is about risk and how much charities are willing to try, and maybe if they get it wrong, accepting that's part of learning, and having that kind of conversation about risk. And budgets was the last thing. I'm looking at my little notes here. Sadly, again, I have seen in some organizations there's an investment in an EDI initiative. There might be some money put aside for some training or bringing in a consultant or whatever it might be. But at the first budget pressure, and the charity sitting saying, well, what's important? What's our priorities? I have seen in few cases, EDI is a nice to have, and suddenly it's not, all the work that you've done is no longer being given a budget. So those are some practical, as I say, maybe a bit negative rather than positive examples of things I've seen that are real challenges for boards, I think.
Thank you, Adele. And I don't think they're negative. I think they are really useful challenges for us to explore, because in ignoring them, we don't resolve them, do we? Just a couple of thoughts from me. And I think as I think about your point around that budget cut situation, and that is why I always go back to this idea that if we can find why EDI is central to our core purpose, and it's threaded through as a golden thread in everything we do, it's part of what we do rather than this nice enabler or this nice add-on. To the extent where I think organizations are now getting quite good at saying, we think about EDI as part of our business planning process. It's not this separate thing, which means that if we're going to commit to doing something, we think about it within our resource. We think about it within the capacity of our teams. So it's not something that's easily just chopped out. It's actually how we do the things that we do. So a head of campaigning thinks about what's my EDI responsibility. The advocacy team think about how do we do this work in a way that's inclusive and socially just. And I think that sort of helps to get away from that it's an enabler and can be chopped easily bit, but also hopefully makes the work a bit more purposeful. I was also go on,
just
please,
to come
Anne.
in there,
Yeah, please.
I'll add a little support and challenge on that. So what you've described is probably an organisation that's perhaps a little further the journey. There's a starting point, like pulling the ring on a can, where just to answer one of the questions in the chat, you might need to bring an outside view in to help you understand and to see the potential. There's so much research. I mean, there's two just out recently by McKinsey and BlackRock that talk about what we all know around the data and the information and the value of having equitable and diverse and inclusive organizations. So we don't need to go there. It's a given. But actually, what you're describing is perhaps on the maturity scale, an organization that might be a little further on, it's exactly where everyone should be, what we call baked in or embedded. But actually at the very beginning, that is where you may need to bring someone in with a specialism who can help to open up the greater vision. The challenge is sustaining that wider championing over the course of that journey. You're absolutely right. So that it doesn't, I think, again, a chat question has said, it doesn't diminish over time and become a bit tokenistic. And that is the real challenge, because many would argue, oh, we've done that now, we can go away and do something else. So that's the real challenge. Once you've baked it in, embedded it, how do you keep it fresh? How do you keep it going? And how do you keep understanding as the world changes and as the needs of your organization change?
So much for that. No, absolutely. Perfect point, and really powerful as well. And I did want to just also touch on the fear point, which I know the chat is also talking about. The fear point is such a big one, isn't it? That we are too afraid to get things wrong, so we say nothing. One of the things I think that building on Audrey's point about that expertise, where that can really help in those early days, is how do we hold a space that allows trustees to build some confidence around this? And that might be about shared language, but it might also just be about saying, how are we going to contract some of these difficult conversations so that we can get it wrong? And rather than that being a moment of deep shame, it's a moment of learning. And it's a moment where we practice our really good governance skills of being able to challenge one another and make good decisions from there. So for me, I think actually that fear stuff is something that external experts can really help through to get people going on this work. I also want to say, and I know this is absolutely a personal perspective, I have a worry that sometimes that fear gets people stuck in silence. And the risk of that silence is so great, actually, because what we're then saying is that I'd rather stay in my comfort than deal with this actually much bigger, riskier stuff of being exclusive or unjust. So it feels to me like sometimes there's a little bit of a push that we need to give to people to say, but the alternative is much worse. You getting it wrong is nowhere near as bad as ignoring the stuff that needs to be done. So yeah, a little bit of a challenge there in that one. Sanjay, did you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, great conversation. I guess 2 points I'd like to add. First one, going back to your original question, is start somewhere and persist. There's been a whole theme around this discussion around this is not easy. This takes a long time. We will get some stuff wrong. We do need to accept that. We need to have the safe spaces. So, start keep going, persist, I guess, is my overall tip with this. Start wherever is appropriate for your organization, trustee board, senior management level, somewhere else, don't know. But the persistence takes a lot of resilience among the individuals running this, because there will be bumps in the road. There's a whole chat both among us and in the chat on the group about professionals, safe spaces. One example I've got in a couple of organizations where I've been a trustees, having that professional has been invaluable, because if you're unsure, you can go and ask and you don't feel foolish. You don't get away from some of that fear. Say, hang on, I'm thinking this, how does that land? If the organization is big enough to have someone as a professional advisor permanently, which one of my organizations does, that's been useful at many levels. We've all asked that individual lots and lots of different questions. If the organization isn't big enough, there's lots of networks out there, or people that have been through it who you can go and sound, so you can go and get yourself a mentor externally to go and ask those questions. So, don't be paralyzed by fear. Yeah, there are resources either in your organization or externally that you can go and tap into. Would be my second point that I'd like to add. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. I'm getting a feeling that probably all of us on this panel are very deeply committed to EDI, and probably most of the people who are here today, if not all, are also deeply committed to EDI. A question that we get asked a lot is kind of the flip side of that. So sometimes when you are the person who wants an organization to do some work on EDI, you might be worried about, well, but how am I going to win over the hearts and minds of the other trustees on the importance of doing this EDI work? We get asked this all the time, and I wondered whether you as a panel might share your advice on how do we win over the hearts and minds of other folks to get on board with the importance of doing EDI work. Daniel?
Yeah, no, very happy to start on this. And I can see in the chat, actually, somebody alluded to actually the process of getting trustees on board or even staff on board in the charity. And I think it does start from there as well. So when it's part of the recruitment process, we often look for skills, experiences that might help to contribute to the board and that sort of thing. But actually a lens that we should also apply, I think, is actually how can they support the culture around EDI and making sure that the charity is an inclusive place, that the board is an inclusive place as well. So I think it's part of the trustee recruitment process, I think, too. The other element around this is the extent to which EDI is focused on from a board effectiveness perspective. So annually or on a regular basis, boards will look at themselves, or should be looking at themselves and thinking, oh, how effective are we as a board? Are we a high-performing board? Now, the metric of that effectiveness or that high performance, unfortunately, doesn't always cover EDI aspects to it. And I think if we were to embed EDI within that, that would drive potentially different behaviours and different perspectives from trustees, and support us in winning over the hearts and minds of those who may not be, who may not live this day to day, or who may not have this at the forefront of their minds day to day. I think from my experience, there are often people who aren't anti-EDI. I mean, I come across very few people who are actively anti-EDI, because they do, when explained to them, they get it. It's just, it's not always at the forefront of their minds. And I think it's how do we bring those out using the right tools and techniques from that perspective. Those are probably my two starters for 10, but I'm sure there are other many good ideas out there too.
Daniel. And Adele, I'll come to you next.
The short answer would be to just align everything that you're trying to do in this space to your charity values and purpose, because one's got to assume, I know this isn't always the case, particularly in large charities, but in the majority of cases, people are either on the board or have come to work for your charity, the charity, because they've got a passion for your purpose, for your charitable purpose. And if it's an organisation that doesn't just have a set of values on a poster, on the back of the loo door, but actually lives and breathes and has all those values really integrated in the culture and the good practice, then you almost, in an ideal world, wouldn't need to talk about EDI. I mean, you could have equity as one of your values if you wanted, for example. A lot of charities have inclusion as a value. So on the hearts and minds stuff, that's where I've always started, is not start with EDI, but start with the charitable purpose and the values and try and convince and win over people by saying this is absolutely aligned to what we're trying to do. There's an education piece here as well, because again, I haven't met many people who are anti-EDI. I have met a few, I have to say, and they're not consciously anti. They just say things, and you put your hand on your head, don't you, and worry how they could think such a thing. So there's definitely still an education piece as well, because if we're trying to get people engaged and win over hearts and minds, there has to be a foundation or a basic level of understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about EDI. And then the last point I would say is that you have to call it out. And this is another thing that in my experience is sometimes difficult. You have to call it out when you hear the wrong thing or you see some behaviors. Again, I'm not going to mention any particular organization, but an internal communications chat function, and someone says something racist, you can't let it be. You have to be seen to be tackling it head on and dealing with it, because and I think that's true of trustees as well. If you don't call it out and deal with it when things are going wrong and behaviors are poor, then what are you actually saying? You're saying we're an organization who's investing in EDI, but actually we tolerate these sorts of behaviors when they happen. So those were the initial thoughts I had in answer to that question.
Thank you, Adele. And then I'll come to Sanjay and Audrey next.
Yeah, as Adele said, calling it out is really important. Unfortunately, I've been in the position having had to call it out and being the trustee responsible for it. So it takes resilience to get through that process, but does show to the organisation that you're serious about the intent. Someone in the chat mentioned trustee code of conduct. That is a great tool I found across many organisations. It doesn't have to specifically reference EDI, but the themes, because it captures your charity's purpose, which everyone has that common belief, you buy into that, but all the other bits around EDI you can weave into that code of conduct about accepting people for who they are, being open to new ideas, and all of those kind of good things, which has EDI woven in, even if you don't call it EDI. So that I would always recommend doing something like that, because then that allows you as a board or whatever, you have a staff code of conduct at all levels to say, how are we doing against that?
Sanjay, and over to you, Audrey.
I think the panelists have pretty much nailed it. My own experience covers both ends of the spectrum, because in the natural environment, I would sometimes in lesser roles have been the person in the room that didn't call something out and just put up with it. And now we'd call it a microaggression, of course. And I've also followed that journey. So I'm one of those people that was at an end where I was a victim, but now I can see I can call it out. My main concern, I think, is for people within an organization who perhaps are in lower roles and feel less confident about speaking up and speaking out. I've seen that, and they've come to me afterwards and I've given them advice and encouragement and said, challenge yourself, because what's the worst that can happen? That individual isn't going to sack you. You've actually helped them, and they might, as someone said to me once, it's a bit like an unwanted Christmas gift. You might not appreciate Great Aunt Martha's woolly jumper with holes that's far too big for you, but you will relish the fact that it was given with good intent. And that is what you have to think about. So in any situation, calling something out does take a lot of courage, but I always think, what's the alternative? That they do it again. So that's very much the case that I would argue. It really can depend on the situation. There are some times where you do need to take someone aside afterwards and say, because it isn't always possible to interrupt, stop and say, hang on. And then there are some times when someone does and everyone in the room goes, ooh, because it's a little bit awkward. But I would always say, first and foremost, think of it like that Christmas gift, just give it, because what's the worst that can happen? And also, do you want it again? I wouldn't want Great Aunt Martha's woolly jumper that didn't fit twice. But on the other hand, I think you have to accept that each situation will always require some courage until we're in a place where these principles are truly embedded and we get up in the morning, we don't even need to have it, and we're all out of a job. That's not going to happen in the short term. And I think actually, to be honest, we'll never be out of a job because the environment is constantly changing. The world is changing. How we think about certain sectors of diversity is changing. We're in a difficult world where you might say something and someone else will ghost you or non-platform you, and that's very challenging because actually equality is all about everyone having a voice, even if you disagree with them, and that's the challenge. So in that environment, call it out, but also reach out to others who you think wanted to but didn't have enough courage to do so, and mentor them, support them so that they can do it next time.
Thank you, panel, for all of those words of wisdom. There are some brilliant tools out there on calling in and calling out. Even a quick Google will give you some suggestions of ways in which to do it and when to do which one of those two different options there. So thank you for sharing all of those. I'm aware of time and I want to take a couple of questions that have come up in the chat there, and one that we were going to talk about anyway. So I'm going to start there. In fact, I'll pose two questions at once, and panelists, if you could choose how you want to answer those, that would be great. So one of the questions that's come up has been around small charities and where do they start? And some of what we have talked about may be more accessible for the larger charities. So what about those smaller ones? Another question is around the role of data in this work. And by that, I might mean staff experience surveys, community feedback, diversity data at different levels of the organisation, the stuff through the employee journey from recruitment, progression and exit, all of that sort of data. What's the role of that within EDI? And then there is a really powerful conversation happening around the importance of the uncomfortable in this work. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. So panelists, does anyone want to start us off on any of those questions?
I responded to the chat about small charities, and it's always challenging. Yes, our earlier point was if you're starting from scratch, you can bring someone in as a trustee, but also you could go and talk to experts. And I think we've all kind of reinforced that. And there are a lot of networks and there are a lot of organizations that can help you. First and foremost, have a look around through those networks, look for other organizations that are on a similar journey and go and talk to them. You'd be surprised. They will very happily down tools and talk to you and share their knowledge and expertise. And it won't cost anything except time. And if you're happy to invest in that, you'll learn an awful lot. So you could shadow as a board of trustees or as a number of members of the board, another organization, go and talk to them and get their experience and harvest it, because trust me, they want to share. They've been through that journey and their job is very much not only to do what the organization is there to do, but to help others. So, and you'd be surprised. And then you never know, it might be your turn as a trustee or as an organization to help someone else. There are a lot of bodies out there that can do that work as well to help put you in touch through networks. But I would say just knock on a door and ask them.
Thank you, Audrey. Others in the panel?
Shall I come in on the data question? Not that for any moment I'm a data expert, but I do think it's important to have a sort of an evidence-based approach to this. I'm not saying it's the only approach. We've all worked in organisations and charities where, you know, data becomes the sort of holy grail, really, not just in the context of EDI. I'm talking about anything really, quality assurance, health and safety. And if you're not careful, I think somebody in the chat talked about a rabbit hole, and you can get, you know, into this whirlwind of data, and it's not particularly helpful. But I think for charities who are, you know, really think this whole area of EDI is important, you need to understand where you're starting from. So having a sort of maybe the word strategy is a bit too heavy, but having some sort of data strategy running alongside the EDI work, I think builds really strong foundations for the future, because you can demonstrate the difference. And some examples would be, I'll use a MenCap one because it's recent. MenCap has a helpline, you know, good old-fashioned telephone advice line for people with a learning disability and their families, you know, all sort of modern technology now around helplines. But we didn't used to collect, and sorry, I'm saying MenCap didn't used to collect any data on the demographic of the people that were using the helpline. We had all the data on how quickly calls were answered, how many problems or issues or challenges did we help them resolve, how much signposting we did, but we didn't look at the demographic. And then, of course, probably won't surprise you, when we did actually start to collect that data, we realized that there were a lot of, I'll generalize, but to make the point, middle-class white families of people with learning disability who knew about MenCap and who knew how to access the helpline. So we started to use that data to employ people on the helpline where English wasn't the first language, people from different cultural backgrounds, different parts of the country, and obviously started to target the fact that we had a helpline, marketing of the helpline into communities where traditionally people with a learning disability weren't being served. So that's just one example, but there's so much data. You can obviously collect data about the demographic of your workforce, and if you're serious, for example, about increasing the number of let's say Black women in senior positions in the organization, how do you know if you've done that if you're not collecting the data? So I think it's important in this data-driven age, not just to collect it, but to use it as a living, useful tool, and have some targets as well around things like we all have to report on gender pay gaps, or we do for a certain size of organization. Why not have a disability pay gap as well, even though you don't need to have one by law? Why not produce one to show that you're employing people fairly? So I think data is really important personally, but yeah, I would be aware of the rabbit hole.
Good, Elle. Sanjay and Daniel, I'm really aware of time. I wonder whether you might give us a quick comment on how do we step into the uncomfortable? What's the importance of that?
Shall I kick off, Daniel? It's important to go into the uncomfortable because a chunk of these is unknown. Just be aware, be prepared for the unexpected, because you don't know how people are going to react, and make sure your board of trustees is also prepared for that. Talk regularly and get the outside support that you might need, whether that's from EDI advisors, coaches for how to have certain conversations, even legal advice at times. So have the open conversation that things are going to go wrong, and then plow on. Importantly, be prepared to change your mind and change your course of action. Yeah, that reduces the fear, because you say, okay, that didn't work, or that went wrong. When I take my step 2, I'll do it slightly different, so you don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
Thank you, Sanjay. Daniel, final word?
Yeah, maybe just a final word, maybe to wrap up what all three.
Oh, I think we're losing Daniel. Okay. I'm going to pause us there. I just want to say a very massive thank you to the participants, because actually the chat itself has shared huge amounts of feedback and really incredible ideas for what to do in this work. So whilst our panelists have been brilliant, and of course I want to thank you too. Thank you, panelists, for sharing so humbly and openly about your own experiences and giving your advice, your expertise. I also want to make sure we thank those participants. I think there's some gold dust in the chat. Penny, I'm wondering whether there's a way of capturing that chat and sharing that, or whether folks can do that themselves somehow. And finally, just from my perspective, EDI work is good governance. The two things are not separable. Thank you so much, panel. Thank you, participants, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, Puri and panel. Absolutely brilliant session. Yes, the chat is included on the recording that we will send. It comes with a Zoom link. The chat is alongside the recording, so you will get that. I've posted in the chat a link to an evaluation form. We'd really love to hear what you thought of this session. It'll also pop up when you come off the call. We've got 3 more events today. So we've got our Charities Heterosexist at 1 o'clock, so in half an hour. We've got Where Are All the Working Class Trustees at 5 to 6 this afternoon. And we've got Imposters on Boards, Overcoming Imposter Syndrome at 6:30. That is the second most popular event in terms of bookings of the week. if you want to if you've bought a ticket to this event for £5 and you want to convert to a weekly pass in order to come to the other events today and to see the recordings from the rest of the week, in my message there, you'll see a code which you can use on Eventbrite to get your money back on this, offset against the cost of a weekly pass, which is £25. And a quick plug for getting on board. We're here all year round. We support trustees in lots of ways. Do look us up if you weren't aware of our work before you came along to this session. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Puriya, Nadel, and Audrey, Sanjay, and Daniel, and thank you all people who were commenting so vigorously in the chat. It's been a great session. Thank you very much, and hope to see you later in the festival. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.